say think relatively, what we feel, what we think, everything is a perspective to us in our story. But to the onlookers, to a person that is watching your story, maybe from the TV screen or from whatever, right? You guys are onlookers right now, watching through the phone, that ultimately you have a perception about what you're looking at, right? And we know this. We know about perception. We know about perspective. We know that we all see the world differently and that we understand these things. These are common sense things. You, Cody, you're not saying anything new. Of course. But look at the world today. The world we live in today is constantly a battle and a fight and an argument and a debate. And it went from verbal in person to now text to video. This is the world we live in. We live in a world of blind, deaf, and dumb people that are arguing because they simply just don't fully understand that it is very difficult to have so many different perspectives and so many different perceptions and then find harmony. How could you? Right? It's difficult. Now the goal is harmony, but it is not a natural occurrence. When you look at nature, nature lives in harmony, right? I mean, I don't know much about squirrels or other animals and stuff, but I don't know. I don't know if they're arguing about Democrat and Republicans or I don't know if they're arguing about that kind of shit. I mean, I could be wrong. I'm not positioning myself as a person that know it all, but what I'm saying is the human being, the human experience is directly correlated to the story of the human being. We study religion. We study stories. The stories have a theme. The stories have a character. The story has a lesson. We're very story orientated because ultimately the story has some kind of beginning, middle, and end, right? And we want to close that loop. So, okay, where are we at, Cody? I get it. Perspective, perception. Where are you getting at? Well, what I meant earlier about understanding certain things and not really understanding why, it was because for me, I was forced to a degree to always constantly look at the world from two different angles. I want to lay out my story because there's other people with their stories, but I want to lay out how my story allowed me to then eventually use it as a tool to kind of navigate through the world. So my story starts off by being adopted as a baby. And, well, adoption is, in some cases, happen because some cases it's a situation where people choose it in some capacity, and then there's situations in which there are unfortunate situations that lead up to a child being adopted. And again, I'm not really going to go too deep into my story, and I'm only doing this out of respect for other people that are involved in my story, but I'll share certain things of my story just to give you the severity and the magnitude of the things I had to tap into to then go outward with, right? You have to sometimes go in to go out. So my mother was shot multiple times. My biological mother was shot multiple times by a very crazy man. And again, I'm not going to go too deep into that story because it's really not my story to discuss. It's more so her story. But just know that something very tragic happened to her by someone that was very close to her. And she also eventually witnessed a suicide. All right, she witnessed somebody commit suicide in front of them after she was shot, and eventually went down a real dark path of addiction. And so you can imagine She also had other losses, but you can imagine that when you're going down such a traumatic path, mental health, depression, anxiety, PTSD, all the things that we can sit here and talk about. She was going through that. And drugs, obviously, a lot of people cope with very strong trauma such as that through drugs. And, excuse me. And so ultimately, I was adopted. Now, I'm not going to go too deep into the whole, there's a whole, you want to find out about how people feel about adoption. You can go on TikTok and Instagram, and there's tons of opinions and tons of other thoughts on how people feel about it. I have my own personal feelings about it. I mean, I'm glad that I'm here. I'm glad that I've, survived certain things. There's a lot of things that could have happened to me, and I'm grateful to God, and I'm grateful to the universe to get me here to this point. But I say that to say also that it taught me a very valuable lesson in the sense that the world will look at that, and right there, once I said, yeah, I'm grateful, the world will look at that and just shut it down and say, good. Great, like, see? Yeah. And that's the perception, right? The perception is like, you made it. You survived. Good. You're strong. And the perspective is you go through every single emotion while others are perceiving you as like you're one of the lucky ones, right? Survivor's remorse is part of that, because like people go to war, they come back from war, people leave the hood and they come back to the hood, and then they deal with these feelings of like, I survived, but like, what do I do now? And do I belong here? Should I even have a happy life? Right? And so from early on, as a young man, I was very angry, very confused, very troubled. Didn't get involved in anything too serious, but for the most part, could relate to a lot of things that people went through, because if you're young and you're walking down the street and you see a group of kids making fun of another kid because their mom is strung out on crack on the street, and everybody's perceiving you as like, well, you don't come from that, but they don't know nothing about you. They don't know anything about you, but you know yourself and you know your story, and therefore you have a perspective. You have a perspective, they have a perception, and this is life. And this happens in every capacity. So from young, as a young kid, I always had this thing where I could like literally, after a while, I became a tool with like, well, let me put myself in this person's shoes and see what they're doing and see how it feels. And that's where coaching came into play. Now, I'm not saying I'm an expert at this in every way possible. Trust me. There's a lot of times that I don't get my wife's perspective, for example, or just other people's perspective. And by the way, this is not an all and be all truth, but the concept is the perspective versus perception causes a duality, causes a split. It causes this good, this bad, this right, this wrong, this satisfied, dissatisfied, the constant splits of endless amounts of separation, of division. This is law. This is law. This is something that is law. And so my story evolved more and more, but just to give you the basis, just to give you the foundation, that gave me the tool to walk in the world where if I saw something I didn't fully understand, if I didn't fully understood it, if I didn't understand it, I was conditioned to judge it. But now, as I've gotten older, as I got more mature, as I evolved more, now I take a moment and I just try to walk through that person. And then you hear again, the next split is what? Empathy and sympathy. Because then you could have sympathy for something, right? You could have sympathy for a person that is struggling, for example. Like you see them struggling and you're like, oh man, that looks rough. Or you can have empathy for a person. Like, man, I remember when I was going through that. Let me go and help them. Empathy usually leads to some form of action because you could feel it in your cells, you could feel it in your body. It starts to press on your pain points. It starts to press on your triggers. That's why empathy is so strong. Now, why do I bring up empathy and sympathy? Well, perspectives bring about a lot of empathy. But when you have perspectives and perceptions constantly, then you're going to have a mixed bag of empathy, sympathy. You're going to have a mixed bag of where, like, I don't really care about what happens over there because it doesn't really affect me, right? It's like I care because it's wrong, like it doesn't look right, but it doesn't affect me. And so we live in this world where that is the constant. And that's another law. It's constant. It's a loop. So you get into this cycle. You get into this cycle of perspective, perception, sympathy, empathy, my emotion versus your emotion. Let's go a layer deeper. So we have our personal, this would happen to me, right? Perspective. This is my trauma. This happened to me. But then we also have a collective. There's a larger trauma and pain or story outside of yours. You're part of a much bigger web. This is the connecting of the dot theory, right? So again, to share more of me so I could make it deeper and more personal is, so adopted. Mom was on drugs. Mom got cleaned up. Mom got cleaned up on the day that I was born. So, congratulations to her. Every birthday, it's also a congratulations to her. Now, why am I bringing this up? There's these points. You know, like it just so happens that on my birthday, the day I was born, she chooses to get herself out of a dark place. So her evolution is sometimes based upon my birth. And we have this constant connection of points that are always happening, that if we are aware of it, we can appreciate it and almost see the path. You can actually start seeing how things are mapping out, so to speak.